Hello and welcome to this third and final video in our series examining the different functions of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And in this third video, I'm going to be talking about the scrutiny function of the Northern Ireland Assembly. So first of all, when we talk about scrutiny, what is it that we mean exactly? Well, simply put, scrutiny is the act of inspecting and holding to account the decisions and behaviour of government. So most people, in fact, would consider scrutiny one of the most important tasks that a legislature can fulfil, because nobody wants unaccountable government. We want ministers to feel like they are making decisions and spending money that they will have to justify publicly and to the Parliament, so that they will make sensible decisions and they will make decisions in the public interest. Now, the issue of parliamentary scrutiny takes on added significance in the Northern Ireland context because most of our assemblies to date have not had an official opposition in place. And when you think of parliaments in general, so if you think of Westminster, for example, or the Dáil in Dublin, or the Scottish Parliament, the job of scrutiny primarily falls to the opposition, the official opposition. So you have a scenario where some parties will be in government and other parties will be in the opposition. And that official opposition, they will devote their time to scrutinising the government, holding it to account, asking ministers why they've made certain policy decisions or why they've spent money on certain policy areas. So you get a dedicated scrutineer in those parliaments. But in Northern Ireland, so far we have not had an official opposition in most assemblies. And we've only ever had an official opposition once for a very brief period. The reason why we have tended not to have official oppositions in Northern Ireland is because of the design of our political institutions, the power sharing design of our political institutions. And we use a system of government formation known as mandatory coalition. And the point of mandatory coalition is to be as inclusive as possible, to include many different political parties in the executive, so that it is maximally representative and so that different voices from different communities get representation at the highest level. But as a result of that, because there are so many parties in the executive, there are very few parties outside of the executive, and therefore very few MLAs who are not associated with the government, and therefore very few MLAs who can devote their time entirely to the role of parliamentary scrutiny. So for example, in one of the recent Assembly mandates, of the 90 MLAs in the Assembly, the overwhelming majority of those MLAs belonged to parties in government. So you had the DUP in government, Sinn Féin in government, the UUP and the SDLP and the Alliance Party in government. And those parties' MLAs, they are all affiliated with the government and therefore are not the official opposition. So you only had a very small handful of MLAs, people like Jim Allister, Claire Sugden, people before Profits, MLA Jerry Carroll, who were able to devote their time entirely to scrutinising the government. So the story of parliamentary scrutiny in Northern Ireland is a bit of an unusual one. Now, that's not to say that we don't get scrutiny. We absolutely do. Scrutiny is carried out by individual MLAs and collectively by the statutory committees. So in terms of individual MLAs, they can table a written question, and each MLA gets to ask 5 written questions per day, and that obligates a minister to release information within 10 working days. And that can be a potentially powerful scrutiny tool, because MLAs obligate the minister to release information, to justify their decisions, to tell them how much money has been spent on A, B or C, and MLAs can then use that information to see if the minister is acting in the public interest and to challenge the minister on that basis. And if you look at the number of written questions, more written questions were asked in the most recent parliamentary year, so 2020 to 2021, than in any other year since the Assembly's formation. So over 16,000 questions were asked in that last year, and that's more than any other year. So you could see that MLAs, or you could make the case that MLAs are taking scrutiny more seriously over time. There's another mechanism that MLAs can use to hold ministers to account, and that is oral questions, and that happens at question time. So you'll see ministers will come to the dispatch box, MLAs will stand up and ask them questions, and the ministers will have to defend themselves or defend their policies or explain their actions. And this is a different type of scrutiny because it puts ministers under pressure in a very public way, and it tends to attract media attention. And as a result of that, MLAs can exercise power in that oral question time, especially if they have, a real zinger of a question, because they do have follow-up questions, and you're allowed as an MLA to respond to what the minister has said. And sometimes you'll have MLAs using the information that they have received from written questions to challenge what the minister is saying in their oral answer. So that can be a powerful scrutiny tool as well. And of course, each executive department is shadowed by a statutory committee, and they inspect the work of departments. They conduct inquiries, they hold hearings, and the minister will have to appear before the committee and answer the committee's questions, or the minister's officials will have to appear before the committee, and committee members can really scrutinise those officials. So despite the fact that we usually don't have an official opposition in the Assembly, there are tools that MLAs can use to hold ministers to account. In terms of scrutiny performance, though, it has to be said that the committee system is not a substitute for an official opposition. Some people who defend the kind of power sharing infrastructure that we use in Northern Ireland, some people would take the view that it doesn't necessarily matter that we don't have an official opposition because we have a strong committee system. One response to that argument is that the committee system is actually not a substitute for an official opposition, because the committees in Northern Ireland, they have a wide-ranging remit, and they don't devote all of their time to scrutiny of the minister, because they have a very heavy legislative role in terms of dealing with legislation. They're also supposed to be conducting inquiries. They have an advisory role in relation to the ministers. So only part of their agenda, only part of their time is devoted to parliamentary scrutiny. So it's not the same as having an official opposition. Some academics like Michael Cole have also looked at how those committees conduct their scrutiny of ministers, and they have concluded that there's room for improvement. Cole argues that there isn't enough rigorous interrogation of ministers by committee members, because the minister will use up a lot of their time making a presentation, a lot of the speaking time making a presentation, and only leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. And Cole is an expert on the conduct of parliamentary committee scrutiny, and he thinks that Northern Ireland's committees, they could be improved. That being said, there have been some very good examples of effective committee scrutiny. I would think in particular of the Public Accounts Committee in the early stages of the renewable heating incentive scandal that collapsed the institutions in 2016-2017. Now, eventually a lot of that work was done by a public inquiry, but actually some of the very important work in scrutinising the Department for the Economy and other departments, that was undertaken by the Public Accounts Committee. And more recently, there was an ad hoc or a kind of temporary committee established to scrutinise the executive's COVID response. And some of those committee meetings were held in the Assembly chamber itself. We had ministers coming to the chamber and were answering questions that the public could watch online and listen to. And that was something that I followed and tweeted about. And you had some pretty good performances from the First and Deputy First Minister, who were able to answer a lot of questions on a wide range of issues. And they were their feet was really held to the fire by some MLAs in that chamber. There is an issue at the moment because the institutions have not been able to function because an executive has not formed since the election a few months ago. We have caretaker ministers in place since that 2022 election, but because there is no assembly, there is therefore no committee system. So at the moment, we have caretaker ministers in office, but we don't have the committee system to hold them to account. So that is a big concern in terms of the Assembly's scrutiny ability. And finally, there are also issues to do with executive delays in responding to written questions on time. Now, we can't blame the Assembly for this. This isn't the Assembly's fault, it's the Executive's fault. But the Executive have struggled to respond to written questions within that statutory time period of 10 working days. And when that happens and you get delays for weeks and sometimes months, that undermines the scrutiny capability of the Assembly. So, in terms of a quick summary then, I think notwithstanding the fact that we don't have an official opposition, there are potentially powerful scrutiny tools in the Assembly. I've talked about the use of written and oral questions in that regard. There's also been some good examples of committee scrutiny in terms of the Public Accounts Committee, for example, or that ad hoc committee on COVID response. However, there has been some academic research conducted into the conduct of committee scrutiny, which seems to conclude that the Assembly's committees could be more rigorous when they're questioning ministers and their officials. There's also that issue of the fact that we have not had an official opposition in most of our assemblies to date. We had one brief spell of an official opposition from 2016 to 2017, but it really didn't get to find its feet because the institutions collapsed shortly after that. So in terms of the Assembly's scrutiny function, it really is a mixed bag. In terms of resources that you might find useful, please do go to the Question Time archives, so the Assembly TV platform where you can look at previous question times and see ministers being questioned and scrutinised at the dispatch box. And there's also a useful animation that you'll be able to find elsewhere on this website that talks about mandatory coalition and the impact that that has on the Assembly's ability to conduct parliamentary scrutiny. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention.